Welcome. This is Ken Stern. I'm the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. And I welcome you to our webinar on our new guide, co-published with the Montana Human Rights Network and Western State Center on what to do to organize the community against hate. And when we sent out the announcement of this publication of this webinar, none of us were anticipating the horrible mass murder committed by a white supremacist this past weekend in Buffalo. We were all shocked and were appalled yet again, but the question remains, and the fact is even now more urgent, what can we, each of us, do and do collectively when hate manifests in this way? Some of the pundits over the last few days have talked about anti-Semitic and racist ideas and what's called the Great Replacement Theory, or blame social media or various media personalities or politicians. But the challenges of how to deal with hateful ideas and hateful organizing long predates the latest packaging of all the anti-Semitic tropes and racist fears, or the existence of social media or cable news, let alone the internet or even fax machines or television or radio or books for that matter. It's more about their communication it's more about the ideas and the communication media. And the question is, when awful things happen, what can we do not only to support those directly and indirectly harmed, but also how do we seize the attention and yes, the opportunity in the moment of crisis to make incidents less likely to happen in the future and to build coalitions and structures that weren't there before? I'm delighted to be joined today by colleagues who have done exactly this type of work for decades, friends and colleagues from the Western State Center and the Montana Human Rights Network, as we discuss our joint new publication designed to help create and sustain community organizations opposed to hate. And I'm thankful for my friends at the Gonzaga University Center for Hate Studies, and particularly its director, Christine Hoover, for sharing the announcement of this webinar and the availability of this guide. Christine, as a scholar, by the way, has also written extensively on this subject. I don't think I've mentioned this to my colleagues, but the early 80s, when I was a young lawyer in Portland, Oregon, involved in the Jewish community, someone mailed scores of happy Hitler birthday cards, timed to arrive around Hitler's birthday, April 20th, to as many Jews as they could identify in the Corvallis area. Corvallis is about 85 miles south of Portland, and I reached out to some members of the Jewish community there to see if I could be of help, and they were eager to have someone come from a national Jewish organization that focused on anti-Semitism. The closest professional ran the Seattle office over 250 miles away, and a few weeks later, he was able to get away and had a meeting with the Jewish community in Corvallis. And when I spoke to someone who had both received one of the cards and had attended the meeting, the message he basically took away was that there were fewer card-carrying Ku Klux Klan members that year than the year before, and that hardly seemed satisfactory. In the mid-1980s, I was delighted to see Lenny Zeskind and Danny Levitas of the Center for Democratic Renewal, publish a manual entitled "When Hate Groups Come to Town." I wish that had been available to the people in Corvallis. And in the mid-1990s, after the rapid expansion of the militia movement and the Oklahoma City bombing, I commissioned Ken Toole, then co-director of the Montana Human Rights Network, and Montana is one of the states most affected by the militias, to write a manual on what to do when the militias come to town. And he, along with others who were organizing against hate groups like the late Bill Wasmith of the Northwest Coalition and Tony Stewart of Idaho's Kootenai County Task Force, which was formed in the 1980s to fight the Aryan nations, and by the way, still going strong supporting human rights in Idaho, met with local groups around the country, sharing their experiences and walking people through the publication and what to do. Flip forward to this center. A few years ago, there were 2 incidents of anti-Semitic and racist property defacement in the Rockaways in Queens, New York, not far from where my wife had been the rabbi of a small Reform congregation. There was a lot of energy to do something in the immediate aftermath, but there too was scrambling and fumbling because people were in shock. They didn't know exactly how to turn that situation around, how to take advantage of the crisis, and while there was attention to the problem, to create something sustainable for the community. More than that, what was the message to the one person or small group who defaced the property and those who might have sympathized with them? That there was outrage for a few days, yes, but it was temporary, and there was no clear evidence, as there might have been, that the hate crime actually backfired, as it would have given birth to a new, sustained, and visible energy in the community to combat hate. I wish I could have shared a blueprint of what to do with the good people in the Rockaways, but the tool monograph, decades old, needed to be updated for a world with emails, websites, text, social media, a pandemic, Zoom, Donald Trump, the Capitol insurrection, and the polarized situation we're likely to face in 2022 and 2024, at a time when fundamental values and rights, like the right of a woman to control her own body, are under assault, and the conspiracy theories we saw fueling the extremes of the militia movement in the 1990s are reflected today not only in more mainstream mass movements, but also political messages from leaders. So I'm delighted that people from across the country, including people in Buffalo who signed up for this webinar, now have access to this blueprint for what to do about hate. And before I let my colleagues introduce themselves and say brief words about their organizations, and before we talk about some of the key sections of the guide, let me also thank a funder, Buffy, who didn't want to be acknowledged in the publication, but who we all thank for seeing the value in this work, who's a true partner in envisioning what it might be and how it could be used. And also to thank you to Stephen Gardner of Political Research Associates, who was incredibly helpful in the preparation of this publication. Finally, we're going to post this webinar on the BARD Center for the Study of Hate YouTube channel, so others can refer to it as a complement to the guide. So if that's how you're viewing this webinar, not today, but on YouTube, you can view and download this manual on the bcsh.bard.edu website under the Publications tab. Now, Stephen's going to say a few words about Western State Center and why it helped create this manual, and Travis will say a few words about the Montana Human Rights Network. Then we'll jump into the substance. We'll speak for about 40 minutes and then take questions and answers that I'll moderate. But please feel free to populate the question and answer section as we go along. Now, Stephen, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ken. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Stephen Piggett. I'm a program analyst, trainer, organizer with Western State Center. And I'll explain a little bit about Western State Center in a second, but just a little bit about me. I've previously worked for the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center, monitoring white nationalist and anti-democracy groups for about 14 years now, which is definitely less than Ken and Travis have, but very, very pleased to join both of them here today. Just a little about Western State Center. Western State Center is a 35-year-old civil rights organization based in the Pacific Northwest and Mountain States, and we serve as a national hub to engage partners committed in strengthening inclusive democracy. Since 1987, we've played a catalytic role building people-centered movements for social justice. At the center, we feel times like these call for nothing less than the 21st century civil rights movement. We know that there's fear, and when there's fear, there's someone organizing hate. White nationalists haven't stopped organizing during the pandemic, and neither have we. Our programs span four core pillars, which are building movements, developing leaders, shifting culture, and defending democracy. And we focus on leading rapid response and narrative shift work, providing training, education, and innovative tools to organizers, and supporting interconnected leaders to help build a world where everyone can live, love, worship, and work free from bigotry and fear. Our biggest program, the one that I'm part of, Momentum, works to equip communities, civil society, and local government with tools and analysis to effectively counter the white nationalism and anti-democracy movements and other social movements that exploit bigotry and intolerance. So just a little bit about why we helped to create the report that we're all here to talk about today. We're currently in a climate where civic institutions all over this country, places like schools, libraries, city councils, and the people who work in these places are coming under increasing attacks from a host of white nationalists and anti-democracy groups. While we're all aware of what happened on January 6th of last year, political violence, threats, and personal attacks are happening on a much more local level in pockets all across this country. With that said, we at Western State Center are certainly encouraged by what we see as well as a burgeoning movement to counter these attacks. Folks like parents, school administrators, librarians, and others are getting organized, and we've had the pleasure of working with them. We've also seen great energy from folks on the ground in small communities who want to get involved and go beyond just sending a donation to a civil rights organization. In the past few years, Western State Center has published a number of toolkits for parents, for librarians, for government officials. And this toolkit that we've co-branded with BARD and the Montana Human Rights Network is really designed for that last group I mentioned. Folks who want to get involved, but really don't know where to begin. So with that, I'll pass it over to Travis.
Hello, everybody. Again, just thanks for coming to learn about this toolkit and this manual. We're glad to see so many people are joining us. My name is Travis Mcadam, and I lead a program at the Montana Human Rights Network called Countering White Nationalism and Defending Democracy. And I generally say that the network works from the state level down and the community level up. And what I mean by that is, yes, we're a statewide organization. Yes, we do work around the state, but we also spend a lot of our time working with local community groups and helping them do work, literally in their own backyards, addressing many of the same issues that are talked about in this manual. Our mission is to organize Montanans to realize their power to create pluralism, justice, and equality in their communities. And we challenge bigotry, we support marginalized communities, and we advocate for legislation that honors everyone's basic rights. A huge part of our work in the, 32 years now that our organization has been around has really been helping communities understand and push back against white nationalists, anti-government militias, other so-called patriot groups, and basically any other far-right entities that come in and start trying to, in many cases, take over our communities. And, as Ken mentioned, as this manual mentions, one of our founders wrote What to Do When the Militia Comes to Town in the 1990s. And I think the need for that manual really speaks to why we were so glad to be part of creating this new one. One truth that we see over and over again is that community members always need resources in order to do the work that needs to be done in their communities, and resources that deal with everything from kind of the basics of how you do community organizing to tips to working with the media, working with public officials, and all sorts of other things that you could probably call like technical assistance when it comes to putting local campaigns and local work together. And over the years, we've seen so many groups that are made of these concerned citizens that look around and see what's happening in their communities, and they're concerned and they want to do something, but they don't really know where to start. And in fact, that's when a lot of those communities in Montana call the Montana Human Rights Network, and we come in and we help them answer those questions and put together actions and activities at the local level. But let's face it, there are a lot of people out there who don't have access to the Montana Human Rights Network, don't have easy access to groups like Western State Center. And frankly, even when people do, it's always nice to have some kind of a resource that you can fall back on and that you can look to. And we just really feel that this manual has so much information that helps answer the questions that we hear frequently from local community groups that are wanting to do something but don't really know what to do or how to do it. And so we're just thrilled that this resource is now available, and we think it's going to be a really incredible tool for community activists to use. And I'll kick it back to Ken.
All right, thank you, Travis and Stephen. I think that everybody can realize why BARD partnered with these two groups and two great professionals for putting out the manual. I'm obviously not going to go step by step through the guide. I will hold it up so people can see it. But I don't want us to focus on scrolling down through the text. I want us to talk about the discussion. And one of the things that the text does, by the way, is it's now in the age of hyperlinks. So if you want something, you don't have to go through, and see what page and look at the index. You can just go to the index of the front, click on it, and it'll take you, if you're talking about, you want to talk about security, you want to talk about how to do media work, whatever. It's very, very accessible. And it's also very pretty. The BARD folks did a great job in putting the publication together. So the publication has sections on organizing a community group, on online versus in-person organizing, on messaging, on disinformation, on communication strategies, on social media, on political and policy work, on security, opposition research, on working with academics, on working with schools, on how to report a hate incident, and so much more, including 13 different scenarios to think through, one of which Stephen will discuss later in the webinar. But I want to talk about the initial steps in organizing a group to emphasize what the problem is the guide corrects. After a hate incident, people in communities too often flail around trying to figure out what to do. The manual has concrete steps about how to put an organization together. For instance, it shows how to have a successful first meeting, how to figure out who to reach out to in the community, and how to do that, how to think about what the group wants to accomplish, how to organize a first collective step, usually an event with a speaker that isn't the end product, like what happened in Corvallis so many years ago, but just the beginning, to get the group's name into the community and to give it a sense of success. The guide shows how not to get bogged down in details that could derail a group, bylaws and other structural issues that should be delegated to a subcommittee, for instance. And it shows how to think about who's going to speak for the group, speak to the group, and how to organize meetings, even when schedule them. Too often groups flounder after the shock of the event that precipitates the formation phase. And people do get stuck in these details. Do we have a nonprofit? Should we get office space? Where should we meet? And so forth. This manual actually makes those seemingly difficult questions easy to think through and apply. Think of it like an IKEA furniture manual, but with really good quality Allen wrenches. And in particular, the manual stresses that any new group forming doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. There are other groups to reach out to for support and information and guidance and collaboration. The resource section at the end of the manual lists all sorts of groups that can help and how to contact the 3 groups that are represented in today's webinar. Now I'm going to turn it over to Travis again to speak for a few minutes on opposition research and why that's important and how to do it. Travis?
So Stephen and I actually had to arm wrestle to get to see who got to talk about this section. We are most definitely big supporters of the idea of opposition research, and it's a big part of each of our positions. And I would just say that, the section on opposition research really makes the case and shows the value in why you should do opposition research. As Ken mentioned earlier, when we see these hate groups moving into communities and causing problems, just sitting around complaining about it isn't a strategy. It's not a tactic. It's not going to accomplish anything. And I think layered on top of that is we need to understand that these groups in question, they're going to come in and they're going to claim that they represent the community, and they're going to continue trying to gain traction in communities to try to make that statement that they represent the community is actually true. So to stop that from happening, it's up to us to really reveal what these groups' real agendas are about. And I can tell you this, the agenda is always about dehumanizing and demonizing certain groups of people within our communities and sending the message that those people are not welcome and that they don't belong. So opposition research becomes this key to shining the light of public scrutiny on a hate group's agenda. And by using opposition research, you can really talk about what these hate groups are thinking and saying and truly about, using information that you get from places when they don't think anyone else is watching. So instead of the clean, polished version and making calls to, oh, we just honor European American heritage, or I'm just a big supporter of the white race, or some of these slightly sanitized versions of messages that they use, you're able to say, oh, but guess what? On Facebook, on Telegram, wherever you might be doing this research, guess what these people are talking about when they don't think anybody but similar, people with similar beliefs are watching. And what that does is it allows you to paint and show a very accurate picture of what that group is about, what their goals are, what their tactics are, and often what their vision, which is often pretty dangerous and sometimes violent, what that vision for the community actually is. And so by providing that fuller, more accurate picture, it does a couple of things. So one, yeah, if you're working with the media, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, it helps influence how the media covers these groups and their activities. But more importantly, it helps feed and frame the discussion of how these groups are talked about throughout the community, just with regular community members. I think the other thing to remember about opposition research is, yeah, it helps you paint that picture. It gives you this material that you can then use with the media, use with allies, use with other people that you're working with, but it can also really help inform your strategies and sometimes the basic logistics around what you're trying to do. And what I mean by that is sometimes opposition research can help you know when and where you should have an event, or when and how you should release a report. So there's just, so much value that comes with doing opposition research, and this manual does a great job of teaching you how to do that work. So it talks about first figuring out who your opposition is. It goes through how to do online monitoring in the safest way possible. It talks about what kind of information you should be looking for, how you save that information, who and how you share that information with other people. And I think, and Stephen really did the vast majority of the work putting this section together, and what he did is created this wonderful guide that will really help you start doing opposition research in ways that will really then integrate into and benefit the other work that you're trying to do. And I think with that, I think Stephen's taking the next section.
Yep, thank you, Travis. So we have a couple of sections in here that talk about media and social media. So I'm just going to cover a couple of those really quickly. Media and especially social media are such important tools for community groups, both new and old. We know it can spread and amplify your message, and certainly can help dramatically with recruitment and base building. The toolkit really provides a lot of good advice for community groups on how to effectively leverage your message and your campaigns through media. And definitely a really important part as well is it helps to navigate potential pitfalls when dealing with media as well, especially with talking with journalists. We also have a separate section in the toolkit about social media and how it can be used for things like storytelling, building relationships with journalists, and how social media in many ways can essentially take the place of something like a website, which obviously can be a hassle to build, especially if you're just starting off and creating a group. And one thing I really like about this section and many other sections in this guide are these contain a really robust resource section. And there's really been, as Ken said, there's been so much good work done by civil rights organizations and community groups over the years in terms of creating guides like this, guides for things like social media. And we really made it a point to include as many of those good resources as possible in many of these sections. So I think that's definitely something to look out for. And there's quite a few links, as you'll see as you're running through the guide. Finally, just in this section, I really think media can also be an extremely useful tool for holding institutions or officials accountable. Oftentimes, a little negative media attention can be the catalyst for change that your community group is trying to make. And in the guide, MHRN has a really good example of that, and I'll pass it back to Travis to run through that one.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So the manual contains a kind of a short recap of something that we ended up doing just last year. So we found out that former Arizona sheriff and militia icon Richard Mack was scheduled to come to Montana and present a seminar that was really all about trying to indoctrinate law enforcement into this militia-based idea of quote unquote constitutional sheriffs. That was bad enough, but what was really bad was that it was endorsed by and being promoted by the state agency that deals with law enforcement certification and training. So that made a bad situation even worse. And so initially we tried to use some contacts that we had within the agency to get it canceled, but it became pretty clear that wasn't going to work. And so we ended up taking the information that we had put together, along with some previous issue briefs we had published when Mac had been in Montana before, and brought that to a reporter at the local daily newspaper in the area of the state where the training was supposed to happen. And we went to this one particular reporter because he had a history of covering these types of issues and covering them well. And in talking to him, it was even an added bonus that he was very familiar with Richard Mack already and knew what Mack was about and who he was. So we gave him the material, and then he went about doing what journalists do. He called around and he talked to a lot of people. And so people within the law enforcement structure knew that this article was going to be coming out because of the, of the interviewing and the reporting that he was doing. And surprise, surprise, by the time the article came out, the official training had been canceled. And there's no doubt in my mind that the public pressure that they knew they were going to receive when the article came out played a big role in getting that training canceled. This was definitely a time when using a media strategy ended up with really good critical coverage happening that was really beneficial. And this is a strategy that we frankly try to use quite a bit. So in this case, there were a couple of payoffs. One, the training was canceled. That was the primary goal. But the other thing that happened is this article was so good and it interviewed people in the state agency, that were sponsoring, that were endorsing the training. The article ended up being so great that we were then able to use it to come up with a little campaign to try to get our supporters to call or email the state agency and complain and say, why were you putting Richard Mack in a position to be training law enforcement in the state? And I think that that's another thing, like you get the initial good piece when coverage comes out that's good, but you also end up being able to use that type of media coverage in lots of different ways going forward. And so, yeah, we really, think, and as Stephen said, that having a media strategy and working with the press can often help you hold institutions accountable. And then, geez, people that work with me aren't going to be surprised, but I feel like I ended up talking a lot today. And so I'll just kind of roll into the next section. I think that oftentimes community members, and not just community members, but even, smaller organizations, the thought of trying to work with public officials, the thought of trying to engage, whether it's, kind of community advocacy or, lobbying with policymaking bodies can seem like a really big lift, and it can seem kind of intimidating. And so one of the pieces of the manual that we have is one that kind of goes through how to build relationships with public officials and how to engage in policymaking arenas. And I mean, I think that we do mention in the manual that there are regulations, and those regulations can be federal, they can be state, they can be reporting requirements, they can be a bunch of different things. And that's really the case if you happen to be part of a formally organized organization. And I think it's important to recognize that those exist, but our point in doing that is to say, yeah, you're going to have to spend a little bit of time figuring that out and figuring out that you're following the rules and how to follow the rules. But in doing that, there's a huge payoff that comes in engaging in policy and political spaces. And like I said, the manual goes through like how you can determine what public officials it might be good to develop relationships with, and how you can go about doing that. And I think that, it also goes through some of the benefits. Some of those benefits include there is a certain amount of credibility and legitimacy that comes with public officials talking about your issues and your causes in the way that you want them to. When a public official is using your talking points, those messages get amplified in media coverage and social media posts and pretty much anywhere the speaker may be talking about those issues. And I think at a very basic level, think of it like this. Okay, public officials have access to that public microphone to spread messages that you would like to have spread much farther, much wider throughout communities than you a lot of times can do just as yourself or just as your organization. So there's a lot of discussion in the manual about how you can do that, how you can think about that, how you can approach that. But I think it was also important that we also included tips on what you can do if it's a public official that is spreading hateful messages or providing cover to hate groups. And, you know, there's some just tips in there about how you should approach trying to hold those public officials accountable, how you should work with the communities that have been targeted by hate and by those hateful actions, and make sure that you're doing responses in a way that don't just perpetuate more hate directed at those communities, but that those communities need to be involved in the planning and execution of, I guess, what you could call accountability plans. And then finally, there's a section that talks about advocacy and lobbying in policymaking arenas. And I always say in a lot of my presentations, like, you can never underestimate the power of good people getting together to do good work. And I think people always apply that to community organizing, which is absolutely true. But I think it's an idea to remember when it comes to trying to get your supporters and get yourself involved in those policymaking arenas. And I feel like that part of the manual, we tried to provide a lot of tips for people that are brand new to this, but we also tried to include some things that hopefully even people that are kind of seasoned veterans, maybe give them some things to talk about too. And with that, I will hand it back to Ken.
Thank you, Travis. And I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the part of the manual that talks about speech and strategies and principles around it. As I said earlier, I've been somewhat disheartened by some of the comments about speech after the Buffalo shooting this past weekend. It seems like people want to talk mostly about social media platforms and commentators and whether things should be allowed or not. And this is a much longer and larger conversation than time allows for today. But what I've seen in the last few days starts, in my view, from the wrong premise for three reasons. First, the idea that we want government to decide what speech is okay and what isn't actually threatens our democracy and our ability to fight hate. Look at China, look at Russia, look at the McCarthy era here, looking at the banning of books in libraries today, and the push to stop teachers from teaching about systemic racism or LGBTQ issues. And look at the history of the civil rights movement and the protests against the Vietnam War. It's foolish to think just give the government more power to regulate speech and things will improve. The government will regulate speech it doesn't like, not speech we might not like. Plus, there's a fundamental difference between truth threats and intimidation on one hand, which government can address, and opinions, even hateful ones, on the other, which must be countered and discouraged, but not censored or legislated against. Second, when the discussion is reduced to how should others limit speech, it takes our focus off more important things, some of which Travis and Stephen were just highlighting. Sure, we want private internet companies to limit hateful speech, and some will, but not all will. Haters will always find an outlet. And third, it's a cop-out to say others should take care of hateful speech. It's our job collectively to oppose it. And we should be working backwards from this goal. How do we make sure those spreading hate, whether on the dark corners of the internet or those doing it for political or financial gain, know their values don't reflect the communities, as Travis said? And even more so, how do we make sure that their hate backfires? There are scenarios in this manual to approach how to deal with media spreading hate or politicians, as Travis outlined and Stephen. But I want to talk about another example that illustrates the point of working backwards from the goal. Let's say that a hate group is going to march in your community. What do? Legal challenges don't work. Haters have First Amendment rights to speech and association. And the government can't pick and choose which ideas are okay to express and which aren't. Sometimes an alternative event is the proper thing to do, and sometimes refusing to give a hate group the oxygen and publicity is the more logical choice, after doing due diligence and weighing factors that the manual lays out very, very skillfully, I think. One size doesn't fit all. You have to go through the variables in each individual situation. But this section most importantly explains how not to fall into the trap of deciding you want to stop hateful groups from expressing their opinions and allowing them to adopt the mantle of free speech so that they can change the discussion from their hate to their First Amendment rights. In particular, we discuss a tactic called Project Lemonade, which in effect turns the haters' free speech rights on their head. Your group can identify a metric, how long the proposed march will last, for instance, and using social media, ask people all over the world to make pledges of money tied to how long the march goes on. The money will only need to be paid if the march actually happens, and the money would go to things the haters would detest. They're threatening a group in your community, money would go to help that group for police training on hate crimes and for anti-bias education and such. They want to threaten immigrants, money would go to immigrant right groups. The beauty of this approach is that it makes the free speech rights of the haters anything but free and gives them a disincentive to march. Sure, march longer. You'll be raising money for countering things you hate. Social media is a great tool to get people across the globe to do something concrete, like making a pledge to this type of Project Lemonade campaign, rather than just bemoan. And it gives local communities the sense that people everywhere have their back. So the bottom line of this is don't fall the illusionary trap of censorship. You can actually make hateful speech cost if you do it right, and the guide shows you how to do it. Now, Stephen is going to walk you through one of the 13 scenarios the manual provides so the groups can think through in advance what they might do in a particular situation based on actual events. And then after that, we'll go to the Q&A section. Stephen?
Thanks, Ken. So just before we jump through one of the scenarios, I just wanted to say that I think this section is definitely one of the most important parts of the guide for a couple of reasons. Mainly is because it examines some of the most common examples of anti-democracy organizing and political violence that we've seen in recent years, and things that we continue to see in 2022. Before we started to write this guide, I sat down with via Zoom about a dozen figures from religious communities, civil rights organizations, and community activists from all over the country. And one of the things I asked them was what they thought would be, the most important things to include in a guide like this. And when I mentioned scenarios, like the one we're going to go through in a second, that was probably in the top one or two things that people recommended to me that we absolutely include in a guide. So I'm really happy that we provided, I think it's 13 in total, different scenarios that again kind of cover really pretty much everything that we've seen in terms of organizing and attacks from white nationalists and anti-democracy groups over the past few years. So the scenario we'll talk about now that I'll run through, we've chosen this one based on the leaked SCOTUS decision that came out a few weeks back, and this is very timely based on that. The scenario is that a local Planned Parenthood clinic is dealing with a weekly far-right mobilization couched as a church sermon / protest outside of its building, organized by an anti-choice group that attracts other far-right groups. So within each of these scenarios, we have a few sections. The first is explaining the scenario or event. So that this scenario, again, is that a local Planned Parenthood clinic is dealing with a far-right mobilization on a weekly basis. The events are part of a broader movement to target Planned Parenthood clinics across the country. And these events certainly attract a number of not just anti-abortion activists, but folks like Proud Boys and others. The second part of the section is explaining why this event was chosen, and why we chose this one for the manual is there's a very prominent group called the Church of Planned Parenthood that organizes routine protests outside of Planned Parenthood clinics all around the country. This started in the Pacific Northwest in the Spokane region, but now it's spread to places like Indiana, Tennessee, and other places. The next few sections, we go into detailing possible next steps, and while explaining that, none of these are a one-size-fits-all, so possible steps you can take to respond to this may not work for every situation, but there are many different things, you could possibly do. For example, if your coalition doesn't have a formal relationship with your Planned Parenthood, reach out and provide support, especially if your local clinic is being targeted by anti-choice groups like the Church of Planned Parenthood. And then we say things like, look, you need to defer to the clinic in regards to safety and security measures on days that TCAP and other groups are planning protests outside. Oftentimes clinics ask for volunteers and chaperones, so maybe that's something that your coalition can work with. The last two sections of each of these scenarios are really important as well. One is explaining possible pitfalls. So what can go wrong? What are things that we should try to avoid? And one for this particular scenario is the clinic leadership will know best regarding counter demonstrations and other displays of support in response to these protests. You should not plan any counter demonstrations without talking first to the clinic. An escalation like a counter demonstration, for example, could lead to further protests and further targeting of clinic workers. So that's just a real world example of a possible pitfall that we recommend that you should avoid. And then finally, the last part of each one of these scenarios is, as Ken said, a Project Lemonade approach. How do you, propose, or let's propose some positive campaigns that can spin the hateful event on its head. And a couple of things we mentioned in here for this specific scenario is, one, your coalition could take the lead on helping to gather volunteers for the clinic. So supporting the clinic by recruiting more volunteers to support folks who are going to be using the clinic. And then finally, on the same day as a protest that one of these anti-democracy groups organizes, your coalition could hold a fundraiser, such as a bake sale or concert or something like that, that would raise money directly for the clinic. So those are kind of the main sections of each of these scenarios. There's 13 in total. Obviously, we've just touched on one today, but as you'll see in the manual, there are many others that we're going to touch on. And with that, Ken, I'll pass it back to you for Q&A.
Sure, and just to remind people, feel free to add. I see some people have put in some questions, but feel free to add more. And I just want to underline what Stephen was just saying, that the scenarios were driven by the fact that people said this would be useful. And the reason I think it's useful is that when you have a local community group and something happens, again, even if you're already established, to think about what are you going to do, it helps to have some tabletop exercises. It helps to have your board or your group think about what do we do in this scenario, and many steps ahead. The other thing I'll say before we go to the Q&A is that we're all in this, not just having to put out a publication and making it available, but we're all eager to help to anybody around the country or elsewhere who may want to talk through any of this, the specific media strategy, or how do you form a group, or any aspect of this. You'll have contact information in the manual, and I'll send out an email tomorrow that will share that with you as well. So this is a collaborative effort, and we're happy to work with anybody who wants to work with us to oppose hate. So the two easiest questions are, how do we get this manual? So everybody who registered, I'm going to send out a link tomorrow to a copy of this webinar and encourage you to share that. And it will have a link to the guide itself if you want to look at it today. you can go to the Bard Center for the Study of Hate website, bcsh.bard.edu, and there's a publications tab, and you can download it from there. So let me start going through some of these questions. So one says, opposition research and monitoring seems like a very time-consuming task. How many hours per week is required of volunteer organizations to perform these tasks? So Stephen or Travis, whoever wants to jump in, go for it.
Travis, since I lost the arm wrestling contest, I'll take the first stab at this one, if you don't mind. Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right in this question. You know, it's opposition research is definitely time consuming. It's very easy, unfortunately, to kind of go down rabbit holes when you're looking at this information. So a couple of suggestions I have, and I think some of this is in the manual as well, is really kind of stick to a few goals that you want to accomplish during each session that you're engaging in this opposition research. What are the things you want to find out? Is it, who are the most active groups, anti-democracy groups in your community? Is it, how are these groups connected to elected officials or law enforcement or folks like that? Is it creating finding kind of the worst of the worst comments and other things that these folks have said? So I think it's really important to stick to a few really basic goals in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, and that really can help prevent you from kind of going down some of these rabbit holes. And I would also suggest putting a hard stop on the amount of time that you're dedicating to this. Again, it's, as Travis I'm sure can attest to, there's times where, we end up staying up till 2 o'clock in the morning looking at something, and at the end of the day, it's like, how much did we really accomplish by doing that? So again, I think if you can set some limits, I think it can be useful certainly for your mental health as well. But I think as well, it can, help you not to get burnt out, because looking at this information can be, very draining as well. So I would definitely stick to a certain amount of time, a time limit, if you want to call it that, to each time you're engaging in this. Travis, I'm sure I missed a few things there.
Yeah, go for it, Travis.
Yeah, no, I think you hit on, a lot of the major points. I think the other thing to keep in mind is, if you're talking about a local all-volunteer group, what you're going to be focusing on, or what I would recommend you focus on, is what's going on in your community, which helps kind of shrink that world that you're trying to get into a little bit, which goes back to Stephen's point about, trying to focus and stay focused. I think the other thing that I would say is, when you start doing this, it's going to be more time intensive, because as Ken mentioned, there have been some social media platforms that do, fairly routinely go through and kick people off. And so, literally 5 or 6 years ago, everybody, at least that we really followed in Montana, was on Facebook. Well, over the years, a lot of those people have gotten kicked off. They end up migrating to other platforms. And so my point is, oftentimes when you're first starting out, it may take you a while to figure out, even once you've identified who your opposition is, where they live online and where they communicate online. And so that front end piece can take more time. And then I think once you have a better handle on that, it's easier, like Stephen said, to be like, okay, I'm going to spend this amount of time a week doing this, and then but exactly where you're going to go. You've found out that piece. So I think that that's helpful. I also know in our community groups that have come together, it always feels like, there are some people that show up who are like, I don't want to speak at a rally. I don't really want to organize a rally, but if I can, sit at my keyboard and do some of this research, I'm really interested in that. And so our experience has been that when you have local groups coming together, that often, you'll have multiple people in a group that are interested in doing this work. And so the more you can spread some of those responsibilities out, the better.
And if I could just add one thing, I know there are a lot of academics on this call, and if you have students that are interested in these types of issues, there are opportunities for internships. I mean, I've sent people to work with Travis and other groups. Again, we need training, we need to know what you're doing to do this safely, but it's a great learning experience. The students that I've sent to do this over a summer really came away learning a lot. And one of the things the pandemic showed us, unfortunately, is that you don't have to be there. You could do it, remotely. So as much as I enjoyed sending a kid from Turkey to be with Travis, who went to his first rodeo while he was researching things, others can do it online, and academics should think about having their students and connect with me or any of us if you want to learn how to do that. So another question that I'll ask to both of you is, so it sounds like your guide is actually generic in its ability to be applicable across the country in all states or communities. Is that correct? Whichever one of you wants to take it, go for it.
I'll just jump in and say, yeah, I think that is correct. I think that many of the sections both have material that can benefit people who are brand new to this, but also, have ideas and tips that hopefully will help, people that have been doing this kind of work for a long time. And I would just say, I think all the scenarios at the end are going to be so helpful, because I know people that are kind of having a crisis in their community, they're not going to want to read the whole manual, but I can see them being like, this is what we're up against, going back and looking through the scenarios and being like, oh, that's close, and starting there. So I really do think that, it's generic enough that it has tools, I think, that can help, that can pretty much help people anywhere, and that have varying skill levels. I don't know. What do you think, Stephen?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that, Travis. And as well, I'll also plug the resource directory at the end of the manual. I think is a really good place as well for that. In that place, we break things down a little bit more there based on different communities. For one example is messaging. How can I find messaging specific to my community? So we've plugged in a bunch of different organizations that are immigrant rights groups, that are MASA groups, that are catering to many different communities that have messaging specific to certain communities like that. So yeah, I think the manual overall, is applicable across the board.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. I mean, the basic principles do apply, regardless of whether you're in a rural or urban setting, because again, you're focusing on how do we make it so that the hatred that's being spread in the community is perceived to not represent the community, and what concretely do we do? And from that, the specifics may play out differently, but the principles are the same. The other thing I'll give a plug for is my colleague, Robert Tynes, did a report for the Bard Center for the Study of Hate last year, which is also on our website. It's called the State of Hate Index. And what it does is it looks at the 50 states plus the District of Columbia, measuring the level of hate by hate crimes, but also anti-LGBTQ laws and other metrics. And it's a good place to go to, if you're in a particular state, because it may give you ideas of agendas for what to push for, and the things that Travis was talking about in particular in terms of working with politicians to expand human rights in the community. It's a good list of what's good and what's not so good in a variety of places. So there were two questions about speech, so maybe I'll start with that since I addressed that part of the manual, and then you guys can add whatever you want to it. One is for somebody who's joined us from not in the United States. It says, does America have laws against hate speech? If not, how do you fight hate speech in courts of law? And the other is, most of your guide deals with hateful speech by groups such as militias. How do we respond when hateful speech is by a lone wolf? So let me take the first question. The United States has a strong tradition of the First Amendment protecting speech, but there's a difference between true threat and intimidation, which you can prosecute and just mere opinion. And one example that I use to illustrate this is I can go on a street corner in the United States and I think all Blacks or Jews or gays or you fill in the blank, shouldn't be able to breathe. I can say that on the street corner. I can't say that if I, with a group of skinheads and have a baseball bat and there's a person I'm vilifying that's across the street, because there's imminence, there's danger in that moment. So it's not just the expression of the ideas, it's the context. So it's very rare that you can use a court of law against speech. And I can tell you from working with colleagues over the years in European countries, part of the problem with some of the laws there in some countries is that the politicians hide behind, oh, we have a case in progress, Holocaust denial laws or other laws. They don't do the things that we're all talking about. We want politicians to speak out about hatred. We want them, leaders in the community to do it. They say, we can't jeopardize the legal process. And then things take years and the opportunities for organizing fade. So that's a different in the American tradition. I could say that, a lot of times people talk about other countries and why don't we have that? If you look at other countries, they're not doing so great on these same issues too, whether it's the vilification of immigrants and others. So that's one set of issues. On the lone wolf aspect of it, I'm going to quote Ken Toole again, who we referred to at the beginning of this. He did that great manual in the 90s. And he talked about the militias at that time as a funnel moving through space. And what he meant by that was that at the wide end of the funnel, there were people being sucked into these groups by mainstream issues. There were issues like land use planning and gun control and federal intrusiveness in some of the states in the West. And once you got people into that funnel, they got exposed to conspiratorial thinking and then certainly anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And then out of the funnel came the Timothy McVeighs of the world, the lone wolves. And what the beauty of Ken's model is that it suggested that the more people you put into the wide end of the funnel, the more people there's going to be pressure to push out of the small. So I think sometimes, and even this last weekend, we focus on the people that came out of the small end of the funnel. But I think what we can do in groups like Stevens and Travis's and Tony Stewart's and the Gonzaga folks and so many others is focus on how do we keep people away from the wide end of the funnel? How do we make the message that this is something dangerous to be in a system you want to go with? And that to me is the more important question that we should all be asking. I think the manual helps us think about. So let me see, there's okay. So can we request a print copy of the manual? I don't have a printer at home. It costs us a bunch to print it, but email me at kstern@bard.edu and I'll make sure you get a print copy. Okay, and another is as a journalist been sent a copy. The staff need to write up introduction, thinking of people like Chris Hayes and Rachel Matthews. Yeah, there was sent out to a bunch of media folks, but I would encourage people who have those contacts or other contacts in communities and stuff to spread this widely. This isn't just for using today, for using for the long haul. And if you have contacts in the media, please share that. And I think that we're almost at the hour, so it's probably a good time to end. I don't know if Stephen and Travis, if you have any last words.
Just to echo what you just said there, Ken, about spreading the manual. I think for folks on this call, if they can think about groups in their community, is their neighborhood groups, think as local as possible, and seek out those folks and share the manual with them. And I think that's really what this is for, is to help build community groups from the ground up and help them again funnel into this larger movement that we're trying to build to respond to hate in this country.
Travis?
Yeah, and just along those same lines, one of the things that we talk a lot about with community groups is, when you're out in rural Montana, you have no influence over what's happening in Washington, D.C. and the policies that are being passed and all of those things. But you want to know where you can make a difference? You can make a difference in your own community. And so just like Stephen said, I think, making people in your community that you work with, that you know are passionate about, trying to make your community a better place, like help get the manual out, because that's what this manual is a tool for. It is a tool for local folks to be able to start coming together and taking action in their communities. And that really is when we can feel powerless about what's happening at the national level, or we can feel like we don't have any power to address what happened in Buffalo, or these events that we're seeing play out all over the country. You want to know where you can do something? In your community. And that this manual is just such a great tool to help people come together and think about how to be active in their communities. So yeah, anything you all can do to help let people know it's around and get it out and about to people, I think will just be a big benefit.
Yeah, and I echo all that. I think it's a great tool, and I would, again, especially encourage the academics, because I know there are a bunch of people with EDU addresses on this webinar, to think, more than what you can do just as a human being that wants to, to oppose hate. Think what your scholarship can do. Think of who you can mentor. Think of reaching out. There's a growing number of hate studies centers, mine, but the one that Christine leads is the first one. There are others that are popping up. There are things that academics can do to help guide this work, to make sure that it's being effective, and to give encouragement. So a special plea to you folks. And thank you all for being part of this today. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Travis. And everybody will get an email tomorrow with a link to the guide and a link to this webinar, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.